to the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. My name is Philip Boone. I'm the Mid-High Director. And today I'm joined by Caitlin Dryke, who is our Director of Communications. Hey, Caitlin.
Hi, Philip.
Today we're going to talk about an interesting topic, I feel, that a lot of churches are trying to answer. It's not just one church, it's church worldwide. And we're going to discuss why are young adults leaving the church. What makes you interested in this topic?
Yeah, so I think the first and most obvious reason that I'm interested in this is that I work for a church. So as you said, churches all over, but particularly mainline Protestant churches are seeing this decline in numbers, are seeing less church attendance from young people. And so both on the staff side and from within the pews, there's a lot of concern and consternation around why this is happening or what this means for the future of the church. And in my interaction with church members, I've found that there are a lot of misconceptions around this. Sometimes church members will feel very anxious about this and then the next minute do something that contributes to folks leaving. And so I feel like it's really important for us to start having conversations around it. So I started preparing some Sunday school lessons for adult Sunday school and just kind of ran away with it. Also, this is a very personal topic for me because I am a young adult. I'm a millennial, and I am a millennial who left the church for the better part of a decade. I kind of waffled between being a nun and being a dun. So sharing that journey and that experience and that very personal part of my faith with other people and seeing how others have kind of been on the same path is all tied up in why I'm interested.
You mentioned being a nun and a dun. What are nuns and duns?
Yeah, so nuns are the N-O-N-E, not N-U-N. No, we're not talking about convents and habits here, but they're the group of people who identify as having no religious affiliation, which is a growing group of people, particularly among young adults. And that group has a lot of different subsets. So there's a huge portion of nuns who would say that they're spiritual but not religious. Duns are a subset of those nuns, and duns are folks who have kind of been there, done that, maybe were raised in a church but have very specifically left and said, I'm not going back.
Would you share your own experience? A lot of people have the experience of leaving the church. That's not completely individualized. There are a lot of people that go through that. Would you be able to share your own experience of leaving, then coming back to the church?
Whew, yeah. So that is a roller coaster ride. So strap in your seatbelt here. So I call myself a recovering Catholic. I was raised Catholic. My parents were pretty regular attenders. I wouldn't say we were really involved. We didn't volunteer at church and go on missions and belong to all the groups, but we were regular attenders throughout my childhood and adolescence. And I say recovering Catholic because if you've been to Catholic church, there's so much ritual and so much that you will never get out of your system, not ever. I think the beginning of leaving for me really started in the confirmation experience, which for Catholics is a sacrament. It's a big deal. And it's about a 2-year process of study before you go through the sacrament in front of the whole church.
What grade would that be?
It's the end of middle school and beginning of high school. Okay. So it's you're 14, 15 years old, kind of in that range. So you're really a stable and functional human being at that point in your life. No, not at all. Your whole life is a mess. So during that confirmation study, I had a really close friend and peer in my class who identified as gay, came out to our youth pastor, and it did not go well, shockingly enough. On our confirmation retreat, this is one of those memories that will just never go away. We're on the bus to leave the church for our campsite, whatever, and I remember this big masculine football type dude who came up to my friend and was getting very hostile and aggressive. And my little tiny blonde self was like, leave alone. I don't know that I did anything in that moment. But looking back now as an adult, I really have to wonder, where were the adults and what kind of culture had adults fostered for that to be the relationship that kids had with each other in a supposed religious space. So I watched that friend really be ostracized. I watched another friend struggle to reconcile the church with how they had treated her divorced parents. And then I have a very feminist, very pro-choice mom, so trying to deal with all of that. And this is in the 2000s George Bush era. So we also had a lot of political prayers in church. And so I think when you are kind of in those situations as an adolescent, you either are none of this or all of this. So I went hard. I was I'm going to be a crusader for God in my youth group. I'm going to invite all my friends to church. We had one youth group session that was okay, you have to get rid of all of your CDs because the music industry is satanic and you need to replace all of your music with progressive Christian rock stuff. And so they gave us this whole booklet of if you like this band, listen to this non-evil band instead. And so I did it. I was a music lover and all of my CDs, I didn't burn them or break them or whatever they told us we were supposed to do because I couldn't go that far.
So before you fell out, you went all in.
Yeah, I went full in. And then I went to college and I moved from Colorado to Oklahoma, which is just a totally different cultural environment. And suddenly church felt like it was everywhere. So no one, I think, in my whole darn life, unless I had asked them to come to church with me, had asked, where do you go to church? And then suddenly it was the first question people asked me. And so it wasn't so much that faith or God or religion was everywhere, but just that church was everywhere and it was oppressive and overwhelming and I didn't know how to cope with it because it was just so in your face all the time when I was used to it being such a private and personal experience. But I tried, I went to the Catholic church. And again, Colorado to Oklahoma, it just did not fit in very well. I was not an Oklahoma Catholic. It didn't click. So I remember sitting in the pews on Easter Sunday and I'm looking at this alabaster Jesus and I'm just Jesus wasn't white. Jesus wasn't white. Jesus wasn't white. And then the priest starts preaching about homosexuality as a sin, which is totally not an Easter message. And I still don't know why. And so then I'm Jesus wasn't white. Being gay isn't a sin. Jesus wasn't white. Being gay isn't a sin. And then I was I can't do this anymore. This is not working out. And so I quit going to church, and then I started being really mad. I started being really mad at Christians for having white Jesus and saying being gay is a sin, and for having all of these Christian youth groups on campus that, as far as I could tell, didn't help anyone. They weren't doing any good for other people. The Catholic men's group, it was this huge embattled thing at my university. They would hand out purity roses on Valentine's Day, and it was unsolicited. So they would just walk up and be oh, you're a chick, here's a purity rose. They only gave them to women. And I was so angry. Our feminist group had counter condom roses. It was this whole War of the Roses thing. Which just further heightened my anger that it was so in my face and it was so opposite from what I felt was helpful or loving or serving. So I was really deeply antagonistic towards Christianity. So then how do I get from there to working for a church? That's the jump that I think is really hard for folks. But I went, into nonprofit work after I graduated, and the nonprofit that I worked at was housed inside of a church. And so it wasn't a faith-based nonprofit, it wasn't religiously affiliated, and it was doing work that I really deeply and passionately believed in and connected to. And this church believed in that work so much that they donated space for our offices. And so that was like the first like little baby step towards church, was like when I had to go into a church building every day to go to work. But then I also had to recognize that there was a shared value, that the work that this nonprofit was doing was so important that they were putting up their resources in the same way that I was putting up my time.
It was a nice stepping stone. You weren't going to church.
Right.
But you were walking in to go to work, and it's a nice kind of stepping stone towards that.
Right. And I think anybody who's ever been in a church over the course of the day knows that you don't just ignore people, right? That the staff are going to talk to each other. They're going to welcome visitors. People are just going to be interconnected. And so I got to build really great relationships with the staff of that church, and ultimately with the members of that church who would volunteer their time or donate their resources, and who would kind of put up for this nonprofit and really do their best to help and to serve. This church also housed another nonprofit, a soup kitchen and food pantry. And so I really got to see, again, that kind of lived values of opening up your doors to other people, of serving them, of loving them, of connecting with them. And so it wasn't the Christianity that I had railed against and been so angry about. And my favorite part, I think, is that the whole time that I went to church or worked there, didn't go to church there, but when I worked there, nobody asked me to come to church. Nobody said like, oh yeah, you need to be a member here now. Like nobody tried to convert me. Nobody tried to save me. So it was just like a gentle relationship with other people that didn't have what felt like some sort of hidden agenda. So that became very therapeutic and very healing, and helped me make peace with a lot of Christianity, to the point where I felt like I could then be part of a church community or work for a church, and be okay with where I was at in my faith.
Yeah, you had mentioned about difference between going to church in Colorado and coming and going to church in Oklahoma. And that was, my sister lived in New York for about a year or so. And she went to a church up there. And one of the things that was a lot different about Oklahoma is it felt that people there would go to church because they wanted to, as opposed to because they felt they should, which is what a lot of, in the Bible Belt, a lot of people go to church because they feel like, not necessarily because they want to, but that's what they've always done. And they feel like they should, because they'll get a one-way ticket to heaven, or and that's a big difference between where you go to church.
Yeah. And I also think that a lot of Christianity is because you should or you have to, and there's, I think, a performative element too, that you feel like you're going to be shamed or
if you don't go. Yeah,
made to feel worse by other people, especially people who identify as Christian, which I think is a huge part of the problem. And when I, started talking to other friends or asking people for their thoughts or their input on this and on this project, there were a lot of folks who anonymously shared their stories or their journeys with me, or asked that I keep their stories anonymous, because they are so uncomfortable talking about not going to church in Oklahoma or not being religious in Oklahoma, because I think there's shame and there's guilt and stigma and judgment and lots of really nasty, bad experiences for people.
And it's really easy to not go to church, because I think everybody, when you go to college, when you graduate high school, I mean, I didn't go to church my first year being in college, and I don't remember ever really going to church in that first year. And then I was a summer intern here, and one of the interns and I became accountability partners, and then we started going to church, and then I joined the choir. So a lot of times you also have to find the niche, because it wasn't until I joined the choir that was like, okay, now I feel a part of something. So you kind of also have to find your niche in the church or within the church.
And I think that's like another theme that comes up in the data, is that people just don't really feel like church is relevant. They don't have a reason to go to church. And sometimes it's they just haven't found the right connection or community or way that it fills them or fulfills them.
Let's talk about data patterns. What % of young adults are unaffiliated with religion?
So about 35%, just over 35% of the millennial generation, so that's kind of like 1980-ish to 1996 birth years. So that's over 1 in 3 young adults identify as a nun. And it's a little bit stronger with younger millennials than it is with older millennials. That number has gone up from 25% in 2007. So it's only increasing. It's not going away. But again, people, I think church people especially, feel really stressed out by this 1 in 3 unaffiliated number, and are like, oh my gosh, those godless young people. But just 6% of those younger millennials identify as atheist. So it's a very small fraction who actually, would say are like godless, which isn't, from where I'm sitting as somebody who did identify as an atheist for a window, that's not, a bad thing necessarily. But I think that when we're talking about being unaffiliated with religion, that unaffiliation, again, has those different subsets. You have your nuns, but then you have a lot of those that are religious, or spiritual, they're just not religious. They're just not going to a particular church or claiming a particular church identity.
Do we have any insight as to why?
Yeah, so Pew Research has done some really good surveys on this. They have their religion landscape survey that they've conducted. So the most recent one, I believe, is in 2014. There was that 2007 number. That's how we can see this spike. And they recently did a survey of about 1,300 people who identified as unaffiliated and asked them kind of why. And a huge part was questioning the teachings of faith. And so, a lot of religious traditions and backgrounds don't leave space for doubt, don't leave good space for questioning, and don't build it into their curriculum. So I think back to being, a Catholic youth, there wasn't conversation about, if you move to Oklahoma and doubt your faith, what do you do? There wasn't space for that doubt or preparedness for that. And I think that is part of why you see that drop off in college is you are exposed to all of these new ideas and research and science, and you take theology classes. And if you haven't been prepared for doubt and that space within your faith, then it's pretty easy, I think, to jump to, well, it's all bogus. I don't need to go. So that is the number one kind of reason that's given in their survey. And I've seen this a lot, again, in the stories that friends share with me, that, they're growing up in very strict faith church homes. And once they start to question one piece, then it all seems to fall apart. And so then it's kind of chuck the whole thing out. And, in many ways is what I did. Jesus isn't white. Gay people aren't sinners. Well, I'm done with the whole thing, because there wasn't that authentic space for that doubt. Another reason, kind of top reason that folks give are the church's stances on social and political issues. So churches have inserted themselves into our political lives. Faith leaders have, weighed in on that. And I think for a lot of people, it feels judgmental. It feels full of condemnation. It doesn't allow them to live their lives as people of faith and civic citizens. And so the church stances on social and political issues is another leading factor for folks to identify as kind of that nun or that religiously unaffiliated. And then a third is that they dislike the church organizations. So the kind of those big structures and the systems that kind of sustain them. You would think that like the number one reason would be we don't believe in God. But actually that's like fourth on the list and is way stronger among those who specifically identify as atheists than anything else.
Which goes to a lot of them being spiritual but
Right.
not being in the church.
Right. Because if you think about the social and political, the questioning the teachings and the disliking organizations, all of those, you can be spiritual and hold those things. It's just when you have that very specific structure of one religion or one, this is the right way to do faith, that suddenly those things become incompatible.
Yeah. And I feel that doubt and questioning is extremely important in the life of the church for people as their faith grows, because without questioning, it's hard for your faith to truly grow. If you're just, this is what I was told, this is what I believe, which is one thing that I try to teach the mid-high. And in fact, we had a whole Sunday school lesson about, part of it was, it's all right to question, because I'm still questioning, and you're still questioning, and we're all using our knowledge when we read the scriptures, to steal some of the Wesleyan quadrilateral, but to question what we're learned and to doubt it, and that's perfectly fine. And some people don't ever hear that, so it's important for them too.
Yeah, I got a little bit schooled, or there's probably a better word for it, but I had probably been on staff here for a month or two, and I was visiting the senior high youth group, and they were talking about what it means to be a Methodist. And one of the youth said it is a faith in the existence of God, or a belief in the existence of God. You have to have that to be a Methodist. And I, from the back row, was kind of, what about doubt? If you have doubt in God, can you be a Methodist? And one of the youth responded and was like, absolutely. Doubt is an important part of your faith, and we shouldn't exclude people from identifying with all of the wonderful parts of our faith for having doubt, because we all have doubt. And I was like, oh, okay, this 17-year-old taught me. Cool. And that is one of my more cherished Boston Avenue memories, because I think that it was one of the first times that I had been in a church setting and had very clear room and space for doubt, and to allow that logic and that science and that reasoning and all of those pieces to really be at play within also a faith life.
We have all this data about why young adults are leaving the church, and you so eloquently told us why they're leaving the church, the number 1, 2, 3 reasons. What can the church do about it? What can we do for them to come into the church?
So I think one is to ask questions and start listening authentically. I was amazed by the number of both friends and strangers who were willing to share with me online why they left the church. And I think that we want to let research and polling data tell us these things, or what we think is the reasons, instead of listening, particularly for our generations that are very concerned. I think we also have to ask churches and church people to think about church differently, that it isn't necessarily just in a building, that it happens in other places. Part of it is how Christians live out their lives beyond the walls of the church, because if you encounter judgmental Christians while you're waiting tables, it doesn't make you particularly keen to go to church. So to rethink church, to think about church a little differently. Just because young adults aren't in your pews doesn't mean that they aren't on a spiritual journey or seeking a relationship with God. And that if you want to be church with them, maybe it doesn't happen in the worship service. I think to build more human connection with folks, and to recognize that church is also about community. So what is the role of this church within the community? To kind of address, there are a lot of folks who are upset about the hypocrisy of the church, or the way that it's inserted itself into politics. And I think when a church is actively engaged in their community, when they're loving, when they're serving others, they're opening their space to nonprofits.
The gospel of Jesus.
Right. When they're walking the walk and not just talking the talk. Millennials can spot BS from a mile away.
Yeah.
We've been marketed to our whole darn lives. So we know when it's fake and when it's real. And we don't want coffee church and fog machines and cool pastors in skinny jeans.
That was actually going to be my next question. What if you have the newest and most expensive equipment to just go all out?
And I mean, I guess I'm sure that like really impresses some folks, but by and large that's not what folks are looking for in a church. They're looking for space for that doubt. They're looking for that authentic human connection. They're looking to be, accepted and loved and not expected to be a certain type of Christian. And just to be respected. So coffee shops and fog machines don't make you feel respected.
So this is a very interesting topic because people think of it as just your church has this problem when it's literally churches across the nation to try to see what they can do to get young adults. And it seems like what you're saying is we really need to stop thinking about going into the 11 o'clock service, looking around, seeing how many young adults are. There are 2 young adults in the service. We only have 2 young adults that go to the church or that are involved in the church.
Right. And I think, some churches that may be the case. You have to also have those opportunities within the church for young adults to be involved or engaged that aren't service. So, something that is very different from being raised Catholic to coming over to a Methodist church is that there are adult Sunday school classes. The church that I was raised, Sunday school's for babies. So when somebody was like, come to my Sunday school class, I was like, no, thank you. I have no children. I have no reason. And then it was like, oh no, it's for grown-ups, which is a really, I guess in the Catholic Church, you either join a Bible study or you're just done. You've learned as much scripture as you need. You're a fully baked Catholic. We don't have to do anything more for you. But, we have young adult Sunday schools here that are really vibrant classes and communities in and unto themselves. And those are spaces in those small groups where, again, doubt has room to grow and conversations happen around faith and faith journeys. People get to explore and understand theology in a way that is more dynamic than just sitting and listening to a sermon. We have a pub theology opportunity that, again, is outside of church for folks that there's trauma in those church spaces, in those worship spaces. My church background, I saw folks get denied communion because of who they were. And so when a sacrament in the Catholic Church, communion is a sacrament, it is a big deal. When sacraments are withheld, that creates a lot of really uncomfortable feeling around church for people. And so you can't expect that worship space to feel safe to everyone or to feel welcoming to everyone because of what other worship spaces have done. And I get that this is a not all Christians thing, right? But because some Christians have really traumatized people, to just say come to my church, it's different. That doesn't help. You have to have these other spaces that maybe look a little different, that allow that healing to take place and allow for doubt and for community and for connection, for all of those good things that faith can offer.
And all it takes is being hurt once in the sanctuary or wherever that I can completely, that has never happened to me. I haven't seen people be denied. However, I can see if you see that or if you're denied, never wanting to go back. Yeah. And that's completely understandable. So we have plenty of we have opportunities here. We have a young adult group that meets and goes to lunch and just went to Camp Egan and had a great time. So there are lots of pockets of that people may not see. It's like at Boston Avenue, if you go to the second service every Sunday, you would think that there's not a youth group.
Right.
Because all of the youth are in the first service singing, and then a lot of them during the second service are leaders in training in the child care. So you can't just, because if you just come to the second service, you think there's not a youth group here. Same thing with that. You don't see the young adults, but they're just different pockets. They're all not going to the traditional service.
Yeah, I think worship doesn't always capture your membership well, but it also, I think, doesn't capture spiritual growth well.
Yes.
There are folks that show up every Sunday and maybe aren't growing. And there are folks that never show up to a sermon but are growing spiritually through, their Sunday school class, their young adult group, their conversations with faith leaders that happen outside of the service. And, a misconception that I've run into with church members and also to some extent staff is that spiritual growth, the most important spiritual growth happens in service, and the most important churching that you can do happens by going to service. And I think that that's wrong, and that if you hold on to that idea, you're not going to connect with young people.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Caitlin, for
Thank
joining
you.
me today. This has been the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. We're located at Boston Avenue in downtown Tulsa at 1301 South Boston. Thank you for listening.
Check out our Facebook page.